video, we're looking at movements that help us to feel the pelvis and to develop awareness of the pelvis in movement. So our first move is going to be lying down. Knees bent about hip width, and just let your hands rest on your two hip bones at the front there, with your hands over them. Just take a couple of breaths, let your body settle into the mat. And then we're going to just tilt the pelvis slightly forwards and slightly backwards, aiming to keep the rib cage relatively still, just keeping the movement low down and focusing on feeling how the lower back flattens into the mat and then slightly arches away from the mat. So you flatten down, slightly arch away, and as you do that, feeling how your whole pelvis is tilting forwards and then backwards. So those two bones under your hands, you'll feel them moving forwards towards your thighs and then away from your thighs. So just seeing how that feels and aware that you're kind of initiating this movement, focusing on your pelvis. It's as if your pelvis is directing the movement. And just checking in with how easy it feels to isolate that small movement there. And also how it feels in your body. And then just take a breather. And we're going to do the same movement with a slightly different focus. So again, tilting forwards and backwards, but this time bring your attention to your hip socket, so where your thigh bone connects into the socket. And as you tilt forwards and backwards, just sense into that area of what's happening. And really what we're feeling for is the socket is moving, the thigh bones are relatively still, so the movement we feel is the socket rolling over the thigh bone rather than the thigh bone moving around in the socket as that would do. So feeling that, how when you move the pelvis, you can actually move your pelvis over the head of the femur, the top of the thigh bone. And then take a breather. I'm going to switch to sitting up. And for this one you can sit on a chair if that's more comfortable for you than sitting on the floor. But otherwise just sitting with your legs crossed or your feet flat on the floor if you're on a chair. And feeling for your two sit bones, the two bony bits in the buttocks there at the base that you sit on. So they're now our landmark to feel and sense the pelvis, whereas lying down we were feeling that whole back flat bit of the pelvis and the two hip bones at the top. So now we can use the base of the pelvis, those two bones, to feel. And you can also put your hands back on those hip bones and maybe thumbs to the back where you can feel the bones of the pelvis at the back. So you're holding your pelvis like a bowl, and then just see how it feels to rock back behind your sit bones and then rock forward more to the front of them. So it's as if you're rolling over the sit bones. And again, you're trying not to make it too much of a whole spine movement. Just feeling that you are directing your pelvis forwards and then back. So it's as if the pelvis is the main driver of the movement. Just seeing how that feels, contacting the sit bones, and then going side to side, so putting a little bit more weight into one sit bone, a little bit more weight into the other sit bone, and then finding a centered position where you feel like you're sitting on top of the two sit bones and the bowl of your pelvis feels relatively straight under your hands. And you can just close your eyes, take a breath there, and notice what you feel in the sit bones. Does it feel like you're evenly weighting on both of them? Do you feel a sense of your upper body weight kind of dropping down and grounding into those two sit bones as your base? Okay, so that's the sitting up version of feeling into the pelvis and having aware of it as part of your body. So for the next one, we're going to come into a low lunge. And again, keeping your hands holding that bowl of the pelvis. And very similar movement, just slightly tipping your pelvis forwards and slightly tipping it back, trying to minimize the whole spine joining in. So it's just a small movement. And feel like you're kind of creating that movement from driving your pelvis forward and then straightening it back up. Can you isolate that small movement? Can you notice how that's extending and then lengthening lumbar spine slightly, because obviously they're connected. As you move the pelvis, your lumbar spine moves. So can you control and isolate that movement? Be so helpful when you do bigger movements as well. And then just shift your attention again to the hip sockets. So they'll be feeling slightly different. That front one, as you tip forward, can you feel the thigh bone might go a little bit deeper into the hip socket? As you tip back, it'll be a little bit more spacious perhaps. And then on the back leg, just noticing the shift in feeling there. Probably in the muscles at the front, they get a little bit lengthened as you straighten up. And just to demonstrate why this sort of control is helpful, when we go into low lunge positions like this, the lower back wants to naturally arch as the pelvis naturally tips forward in the movement. And that's fine, but if we want to kind of create a little bit more feeling of length in the lower discs of the lower spine, if we are aware that we can kind of tilt the pelvis back and just try and do that a little as we go forward, that can just help to create a little bit more length in the lower back as you go forward. So even though your pelvis is still tilted forward, it's almost like you slightly resist that and draw the pelvis back and see if that gives you a feeling of a more balanced position rather than it feeling like you have to go to the max of pelvis tip forward, lower back, arching back. So it's just something you can play with. Okay, from there, I'm going to stand up. And same thing, just holding the bowl of your pelvis. You can visualize it as a bowl filled to the brim with water, and you can tip some water out the front, and then you can straighten your bowl up so that water doesn't tip out. Can you control that movement standing up? And again, you can feel that as the pelvis moving over the tops of the thigh bones, which aren't moving so much. So driving the movement from the pelvis. And then we'll take that a bit further into a forward bend, so we call it a hip hinge, and see how this feels. So you initiate movement forward in the pelvis and then just keep going so that you can feel the pelvis is rolling over the tops of the thigh bones. The thighs do move back a bit, but not so much. And then coming all the way back up, straightening your bowl back up. And this is a great thing to practice to see if you can choose to move in this very specific way of hinging at your hips, keeping your spine relatively flat feeling rather than the spine wanting to round with the movement. So can we isolate that movement of forward folding from a pelvic tilt forward? And this just means if this is then an accessible movement for your body, it feels really natural to find when you're moving in more complicated ways. Okay, so tipping forward, feeling that hinge, and coming all the way back. Okay, so there's just some ways of forwards and backwards movement in the pelvis. You can feel in lots of different positions and feel like the pelvis is the driver or initiator of the movement rather than feeling like your legs are doing the driving of the movement.